There doesn't seem to be many higher refresh rate, larger size monitors on the market, but Gigabyte are trying to change that with the M32Q. This is a 31.5 inch IPS 170Hz 1440p panel that has HDR support. In this review, you're going to be seeing if it's worth its price tag, because in the UK it can be found for around £480. Now, to kick things off, we're going to talk about its gaming performance, and here I do have to reference its refresh rate. It runs a native 165Hz at 1440p, but if you do want the extra 5Hz and want to run at the OC 170Hz, then you're going to have to enable it through the OSD and make sure you're connected in the right way. In my case, over DisplayPort on a RTX 2080 Super, I had no frame skipping issues to report. Really, what I want to kind of highlight over here is between 165Hz and 170Hz, there's really no difference, let alone between these two refresh rates and 144Hz. Now, with that out of the way, let's get on to its input lag. Now here, the monitor does a decent job. Is it a monitor that I would personally use to play some hardcore competitive games such as CSGO? No, but it is a monitor that I would see myself, well, happily using if I'm going to be playing at a lower level of CSGO or indeed playing more casual games. Absolutely. The input lag is perfectly acceptable. I had no problems when it was coming to registering my op flicks or clicking array and indeed hitting some heads on CSGO, but still, it's not a monitor that I would personally pick, and specifically when you compare it to smaller sized 1440p monitors that run IPS or VA panels, it's not quite up there with the very best. Now, similarly, the same could be said about its response time. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that very much like every monitor out there on the market, you've got a few different OSD settings that you can choose from, and here you have got the overdrive modes. Now, in its highest overdrive mode, you do get quite a bit of inverse ghosting. Now, is it acceptable in a game like Counter-Strike that looks like a potato? Absolutely. But is it acceptable in a game that's more graphically intense, even let's say Valorant or let's say Destiny 2? No. The amount of inverse ghosting that is present in its highest overdrive mode will make you throw off your shots, or indeed will give you a little bit of an impaired visual experience. As such, you're going to probably want to dial this to the balanced overdrive mode and therefore incur a higher response time of the monitor and therefore having a slower monitor and therefore getting a better visual experience. Ultimately, what I'm really trying to convey over here is that the monitor isn't quite suitable for hardcore competitive gaming because the combination of its response time, indeed its overshoot ghosting and its input lag don't make it quite suitable for hardcore gamers. But it's still an okay monitor on the whole. It's not exactly terrible. Now, for you casual gamers out there who are looking for a high refresh rate monitor at 1440p and 31.5 inch form factor, then the monitor is absolutely spectacular for you guys. Because here the monitor does a really good job in terms of combining its input lag and response time, and specifically when you dial it to its balanced overdrive mode, you don't get too much overshoot ghosting, meaning the overall experience that you're getting is actually pretty agreeable, and therefore if you're a casual gamer, this monitor will probably tick that box. In other words, the performance will suffice. However, for those who play HDR games, you will be disappointed to know that this monitor has got the HDR 400 certification and nothing above. Indeed, it hits around 400 nits in terms of peak brightness, and we'll talk about this very shortly. But in this respect, over HDR, well, it doesn't really give you a bettered experience over an SDR image. Of course, there is a little bit of an increased contrast and all that stuff, and of course the bettered peak brightness you get over HDR is going to give you a little bit of a bettered experience over the SDR image on this Gigabyte monitor. But frankly here, if you're going to be looking for a fantastic HDR experience, look for an HDR 600 or above monitor as a bare minimum. If you can really afford it, a full array local dimming monitor here will be fantastic, but then that will cost you a pretty penny. Now, I should also quickly reference AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. Of course, I can only test the latter because I've got an RTX 2080 Super, and in this instance I had no issues running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, neither did I notice any sort of artifacts or any sort of flashing images. Similarly, when I was running Destiny 2, I was able to run this simultaneously while running at 1440p, 170Hz, HDR and G-Sync, all of them running at the same time, and again, no issues to report. The only thing I should just be bearing in mind over here is that if you do want to run this monitor over HDMI, you're going to be limited in terms of the HDMI 2.0 specification, and therefore limits you in terms of the overall bandwidth you can achieve, and thus the overall refresh rate you can achieve over HDMI. So if you really want to benefit from the maximum refresh rate and the resolution, you'll want to run it over DisplayPort. So now we get onto its image quality, and as I did reference before, it's a 1440p IPS panel, and put across my Datacolor SpiderX Elite, I noted a 98.4% sRGB gamut coverage and a 136.1% gamut volume. You can see the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 coverage are pretty impressive as well, because it's a wide color gamut monitor. But in comparison to the sRGB standard, you can see it's a little bit off, and in comparison to the DCI-P3 standard, it doesn't quite hit it. Now when it comes to color accuracy, again, in terms of its sRGB mode through the OSD and in terms of against the sRGB standard, it hits an average delta of 1.06 and a maximum of 4.26. Contrast ratio is 924:1, which is acceptable but just a little bit below par in comparison to its competitors. Now here, ultimately, the monitor can be used for color editing or indeed video grading. If, however, you're going to be a gamer, you'll probably want to run it in terms of its standard or warm modes, because it just seems a little bit more saturated and a little bit more vivid to your eyes. In this respect, you're not going to get the pinpoint sRGB color accuracy, but in the other aspect, you'll get something that's a little bit more vivid. So really, it depends in terms of your use case, but in terms of the image quality goes, it's actually not a bad panel. Now moving swiftly on, we get on terms of the peak brightness, and as I did reference before, it does have a different SDR and HDR brightness. In terms of its HDR peak brightness, I noted 443 nit, and in terms of SDR, it gets to 330 nit with a minimum of 55 nits, which is perfectly acceptable and therefore can be used in a bright sunlit room without any sort of issues. Now moving past this, we have also got brightness uniformity. Of course, I do appreciate this is somewhat panelotry, but you can see in terms of my monitor, it does an okay job, but it's a little bit off in terms of its bottom left. And as for the overall backlight bleed given its IPS panel, it's actually a little bit more noticeable. If you're going to be playing really dark games, and given the size of the monitor, you could notice a little bit of bleed. But again, this is somewhat panelotry, so it really depends in terms of what type of gamer you are. But if you're looking for kind of deep blacks and not sort of noticing any sort of IPS bleed, you're probably going to want to go for a VA panel instead. Now moving on to the monitor's OSD and settings, it's worth bearing in mind that here, like other Gigabyte monitor products that I've previously reviewed, this does have a software-based OSD called OSD Sidekick. Now here it's worth bearing in mind that you will need to connect over the USB Type B to Type A cable to your computer that is provided in the box, and this will allow you to customize your settings on the fly. But the OSD that we'll be focusing on is the hardware-based OSD that can be accessed through a joystick button found behind the monitor. Now here you've got the gaming settings, and there's a few different settings over here, and the one which will be of greatest interest is the overdrive mode, or the one that you will frequently be adjusting. Here, as I did reference in the gaming section, it really depends in terms of your settings, but speed and balance are the ones I would suggest. As for AMD FreeSync, I don't usually have this enabled, but of course, if you're a more casual gamer, then you might want to have that enabled. Now, as for the picture mode, standard mode is probably what you'll want to run if you're just a gamer and you're not too concerned about sRGB color accuracy and you want a sort of saturated or vibrant sort of image. If, however, you're going to be doing any image work or video work, then I would suggest going on the sRGB mode, which tones down the colors but then indeed locks a lot of other settings. Here it's worth bearing in mind that the brightness mode is not locked, so that's always a positive sign. It's nice to see that's not the case on this Gigabyte monitor. Now going through the display, you have got the overclock, which I did reference before, which I do find a little bit silly, but nevertheless you'll have to enable this option over here if you want to access the 170Hz refresh rate. Now as for PIP and PBB mode, they're pretty self-explanatory, but this is going to be useful for those people with multiple different sources, including those people who are going to be using this alongside the KVM switch, the built-in KVM switch. And as for the system, you've got the audio, so it's got built-in speakers. They're not exactly that fantastic, fine for basic music listening, but if you are buying a monitor of this caliber, I think you'll have a set of bookshelf speakers and or a DAC and a set of headphones. The rest of the settings are pretty self-explanatory and nothing really worth bearing in mind. Now I should also mention that when you do click on the rear button, you can see the KVM multitask, and here will allow you to adjust a few different settings, including the source. Elsewhere there is a hardware-based KVM button found behind the monitor, allowing you to quickly switch without having you to fiddle around with the OSD. Elsewhere you do have Game Assist, which gives you a few different controls, so for example crosshair, that if you want to enable or disable, and indeed you've got a few different settings over here that you can tinker around with if you're going to be using them. Now moving past the OSD, I should also reference the stand, which provides a very sturdy feel as the monitor, which is its 31.5 inch form factor, and here the three-side borderless design means that it doesn't take too much space on your desk. Elsewhere, I should also reference that if you don't want to use the built-in stand, you can use a VESA-compatible stand and therefore have it in terms of a multi-monitor setup, or let's say a monitor arm. But if you do use the built-in stand, it provides height, tilt and pivot adjust, although it can't be rotated, but that's no surprise given the size of the monitor and potentially the use case of it for gamers. And so this leads me on to my verdict. Would I recommend this Gigabyte monitor? Well, frankly, I do see a market for it, for those people who want larger sized format, higher refresh rate monitors, and an IPS panel, which is very important. The reason I say that's very important is because if you look elsewhere, there's some VA-based panels which can be found for cheaper and or offer a superior gaming experience. By gaming experience, I mean more for the casual gamers out there on the market. So for example, with the HDR 600 certification with some Samsung monitors, or if you want a great VA panel and you don't want HDR 600 or HDR support of such, then you can look at some Asus or AOC alternatives. Namely, the latter over here can be found for around £280 at the time of filming, which is around £200 cheaper than this Gigabyte monitor. So frankly, if I was a casual gamer, I wanted a larger size format, I'd get the AOC alternative instead. But of course, I do appreciate not everyone wants a VA panel, so then therefore this monitor might appeal for certain gamers out there, but I can't personally see myself flat out recommending it. So if you do want to see my recommendations, they'll be down in the description below. And of course, if you've got any questions whatsoever, do ask me down in the comments section below, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my knowledge. Now, if you've appreciated this independent detailed review, definitely do drop a like and of course subscribe, all of which is greatly appreciated. And of course, do take care of yourselves. I've been Totally Dubbed, and goodbye.